transitioned over to the Forest Service Northern Research Station in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. And I was working on this internship project with Sarah Johnson from Northland College, which is in Ashland, Wisconsin, and Robert Lieberman from the Washburn Ranger District. And he's currently moved positions as well over to another national forest. And we were working with a student that we hired from Northland College as our intern, Maria Lefevre, on this project. And the project title was Plant Functional Traits as Indicators of Restoration Success in Pine Barrens Under Prescribed Fire Management. A quick overview of what I'll be discussing today. I'll give some background information on our study area, talk about the project objectives in terms of both the research and the intern objectives, the methods that we used, our results, and also talk about the implications of our results and future directions for research. So our project took place in the Muckwa Barrens. You'll see on the right-hand side here, we're gonna slowly zoom into that region. It's located just off of the Chequamegon Bay near Lake Superior. The closest city is Ashland. And the word for Muckwa actually comes from the Ojibwe word for bear, and barrens is a type of savanna habitat that exists on nutrient-poor soils, and these are typically fire-dependent ecosystems. And it's really important, even though our study was taking place in the Barrens type habitat, to know that this is a really diverse region. So there's a mosaic of habitat types. It's not just barrens that occur here, although barrens are ecologically important, and that's why we chose to study those. So the barrens, like I just mentioned, are our savanna type habitat, and those are going to have less than 50 trees per acre. But you can also see that these exist among pine woodlands, brush, and deciduous woodlands and forests. Our pine woodlands in this area are predominantly red pine and jack pine plantations. And the deciduous forest consists mostly of aspen, birch, oak, and some red maple. And we also have a lot of this brush cover habitat because of woody encroachment into barrens, formerly barrens habitat types. And that's largely due to fire suppression in this area. And because of that, barrens have actually become an imperiled habitat type. So less than 1% of their pre-European settlement extent remains throughout the Great Lakes region. Like I already mentioned, a lot of that is due to fire suppression and also due to other types of land use change. But currently there are about 23,000 acres of barrens and savanna under restoration through a project called the Northwest Stands Restoration Project. And if you look at this image on the left here, this is a land fire map of fire return interval in that Northwest Stands ecological area, which is primarily this big red and orange swath that you see going diagonally through the middle of that image. And the red coloration here is actually indicating a fire return interval of about 5 to 10 years. However, one recent study reported that this fire return interval is now up to about 43 years throughout the Muckwa Barrens area. That was a study by Gayet et al. Published in 2016. So we see this significant land cover change, and we know it's associated with changes in fire return interval. So the objectives of the study for the intern project, which took place from June through August of 2019, were to monitor plant phenology weekly. And when I say phenology, that includes a range of traits that are seasonal, so life cycle events like the timing of leaf buds breaking, flowering, and fruiting. We also measured leaf traits monthly, so whole plants were collected, brought back wet on paper towels, and traits were measured in a lab. And we also collected whole plants, which were monitored throughout the entire study to bring back for biomass measurements at the end of the study to get both above ground and below ground investment. And our goal was to relate all of these different traits to fire tolerance and prescribed burn history throughout the Muckwa Barrens. Because different areas of Muckwa have different burn histories, so you'll see coming up in a couple of slides, I'll show a map, but areas are long unburned all the way up to having 10 prescribed burns since the 1960s. Just to review what I mean when I say a plant functional traits, these are traits that represent some sort of functional specialization to local conditions. So those are going to be adaptations relating to resource use and allocation, and also to disturbance and stress. So in this case, prescribed fire would be a predominant disturbance on the landscape. And it's very well known that trade-offs occur among different functional traits, so they tend to be interrelated. So a couple examples just to illustrate what I mean by that is that, for instance, with greater investment in roots, you're going to have less resources to invest into shoots or above ground tissue. And another example would be plants that make thick or high quality nitrogen rich leaves tend to be slow growing. So you'll have trade-offs between growth rates and other traits. And it's pretty well known throughout the literature that different plant communities will exhibit different trait means among these different plant functional traits. But what we were interested in investigating was whether Barrens plant communities show variation in plant functional traits along a gradient of prescribed burn history. So rather than comparing different plant communities, we're actually comparing similar plant communities that have different management histories, specifically in frequency of prescribed burns. And these traits matter because species composition doesn't necessarily provide information about resiliency to things like fire-based disturbance. So phenology and leaf level traits are going to possibly reflect plant resource acquisition and growth and persistence, and potentially tell you about whether the community that's present is well adapted to fire. Plant traits can vary according to disturbance. I've mentioned fire. Another example might be grazing, but it's also important to know that site quality is going to influence these functional traits. That includes factors such as light availability, nutrient availability, and soil moisture. So fire can directly impact plant traits, or it can indirectly impact these traits via changes on site quality. So I provided really small down here. An example of this could be feedbacks that occur like mesification. So under a fire exclusion example, you might expect soils to become more moist and sites to become more shaded, and you get a positive feedback with woody vegetation in that instance. And just to kind of tie in the intern training objectives for the project, we wanted the intern to come out with strong plant identification skills, the ability to interpret scientific literature, collect and enter data, use image analysis software and spatial analysis software, and then also to introduce our intern to the different career options in both academic and federal fields, and land management versus research. So now into our study sites. This is a map of one of the burn units and surrounding areas in Moqua. And this square area right in the middle here is what's known as a research natural area. You might be familiar with these. This particular one is 1 square mile, and it's surrounded by a burn management unit. So this provides us good spatial correlation for sites, but a really strong contrast in their management history. So the research natural area was established in 1935 and has had no management. That includes timber harvest and fire from within that area. And you can see this matrix of burn history. So the orange colors are indicating high burn frequency with about 7 to 10 burns in the southwest or bottom left area. And the upper portion where it's blue, those areas have only been burned about 1 to 3 times. So we established 4 study sites for each of the different categories of burn frequency. So 4 long unburned sites, 4 sites that were in early restoration stage, and 4 sites that were in a later restoration stage throughout this area. And just, this is important to note for later on, these sites were all a barrens or savanna type habitat, which means that they did all have a very open canopy and continuous understory layer. But there are pretty significant differences in the extent of openness when we look at aerial images that really shows. So on the left, you can see a few of our study plots in that long unburned reference area. And these exist as pretty small fragments in a forested landscape. And that's in contrast to this image on the right here, showing a couple of our study sites that are in a really well-maintained historic barren site that has been subjected to greater fire frequency. So although they're all barrens, they occur in a pretty different surrounding larger area. And once these sites were established, we tagged some of the species that we chose as focal species for the study. Those included bracken fern, blueberry, sweet fern, bearberry, wintergreen, and grass species, which were actually Danthonia and Carex, or Pennsylvania sedge. Once those species were tagged in the field, we used phenology surveys to track their growth and life cycles. And there's an example of one of these surveys here on the right. So you'll see the intern was recording the species and individual. We tried to get 5 representatives of each individual at each site, recorded the height, and then we built the survey based off of an existing survey from the National Phenology Network. So if you're interested in doing this type of work, you can check out Nature's Notebook, and there's kind of an existing database for how other people have tracked phenology of various species throughout the US. But in our case, we focused on the timing of leaf, flower, and fruiting events. And then on a monthly basis, we were collecting individuals. These were not the tagged individuals. They were extra individuals of the focal species to look at leaf traits. So we collected plants, brought those back to the lab at Northland College, and analyzed them for leaf traits. Those included the wet mass and dry mass of the leaf, which are important because with those 2 values, we can calculate a metric called leaf dry matter content, which is just a ratio of dry to wet weight. And that provides some information about how much the plant is investing into photosynthetic material. And to measure the leaves in the lab, we used a program called ImageJ. This is a free image analysis software you can download online. The intern was scanning freshly collected leaves and then using image J to calculate leaf length, leaf width, and leaf area. It's pretty straightforward. You just include a ruler in your image for calibration, and then you can calculate all those metrics directly in the program. And one of the important functional traits, again, in this case, is called specific leaf area. So that's the area per unit mass. And then finally, at the end of that 3-month study period, the intern collected the tagged plant individuals that she was tracking phenology for throughout the study. And the purpose of collecting these was to determine plant investment in above ground versus below ground biomass, so we could calculate a root to shoot ratio. So now I'm going to dive into some of the results. I chose to narrow it down because we obviously have a lot of types of data, but also a lot of species that we were looking at. And one thing to point out right away is that during these surveys, the monthly surveys, the intern was monitoring soil and site conditions. So one thing we saw was that at these long unburned sites to the left here, they tended to be cooler in soil temperature, which is the red dots, as compared to the sites that had been burned. So they're more cool and dry versus hot and dry, although we did see some variation. And that held up across months. And just keep in mind those microsite conditions are also potentially important in determining plant traits. So here's one of our first results. This is looking at plant biomass. So this is the root to shoot ratio. That's on the y-axis here. And across the x, we have our plot number, which doesn't really matter, but this color scale tells us about the burn history for those plots. So these are arranged in order of no burns to all the way up to 10 burns. So the green colors are 0 burns, and then we have 2, 5, 9, and 10 burns present. And I was surprised to not see any differences here, because typically you expect with fire that plants might invest more in their root systems, so they have resprouting capability post-fire, but we did not see that. However, when we looked at just the root and shoot biomass separately, we did see that the below ground and above ground biomass were both elevated in sites that had never been burned and that had only been burned twice, which is that lighter green color. So it does look like with more burning, there is a lower overall investment in plant tissues, both above ground and below ground, but the ratio of root to shoot mass stays the same. For leaf traits, we looked at specific leaf area in this case and saw some differences. This is for Vaccinium angustifolium, or lowbush blueberry. And again, on the left, we're looking at June results, and on the right, we're looking at August. So early in the season, we could see appreciable differences in that SLA metric for sites that were never burned or that had only been burned twice versus sites that had been burned from 5 to 10 times. So it does look like early in the growing season, you do see differences in growth patterns, but by August, those differences are completely diminished. And this could be partially related to those microsite conditions, which were also much more different early in the season than they were in August, because this field season by August, it was just hot and dry everywhere. There was not a lot of rainfall that summer. And just a quick mention, SLA is a trait that tells us about potential growth rate. So we would say, looking at this left figure, that blueberry plants from sites that had been burned more frequently appear to show a higher potential relative growth rate. Another example for a different species, that same trait though, so this is again looking at specific leaf area, which tells us about growth potential. This time for grasses and sedges. You can see that these do not necessarily follow a pattern with burn frequency. However, if you recall the microsite or soil information from the different plots, we do see that there's one site, this plot 3300, that's elevated relative to all the others. That was the site that was also an anomaly for soil moisture and soil temperature. So I think based on these results, grasses and sedges are probably just more plastic and respond very rapidly to the current soil conditions rather than tracking those longer term differences that result from burn history. So a grass might be able to adjust resource allocation instantaneously since they're fast growing versus a plant like a blueberry or a sweet fern. Our phenology results, these are ongoing. There's a lot of data in the surveys, but these are a few take-homes that I've seen so far. Unfortunately, we did initiate the surveys after a lot of important phenological events had already started. So by the time we started surveys in June, leaf buds had already broken pretty consistently, and there was even already flowering occurring. So we did miss the initiation dates for some of those things. There was also very high mortality initially. So for instance, 100% of the bracken fern plants that we tagged in June had died by July, and those are a more music species out of the ones that we surveyed. So that does make sense somewhat. And I also noted that the categories provided by Nature's Notebook might not be as appropriate for Moqua as they are in other systems. And that could be because plants in Moqua have stunted growth that's due to the really droughty, nutrient-poor soil conditions in that system. And for example, the flowering and fruit counts never broke above the 10 to 100 class. So we might want to change that response variable into smaller slices just so we can actually track changes more accurately there. And to summarize quickly, our frequently burned sites looked like they had more extreme soil conditions. And by extreme, I just mean very hot and dry, whereas soils were slightly cooler at the long unburned sites. And that could be important because native pine barrens plant species are very well adapted to hot, dry, nutrient-poor soils, and that's what kind of gives them a competitive advantage over woody plants. The most common barren species that we saw among all of the sites that we surveyed was blueberry, and that also showed the greatest amount of trait variation among sites. So blueberry would be a very good species to use in future trait studies. And on the opposite end, some species showed very little trait variation. So especially the woody evergreen low shrubs, which in this case were Gaultheria and Arctocephalus, would be less useful for plant functional trait studies in this system. So I wouldn't even bother surveying them in the future. And that's just because those are really constrained in their trait plasticity. Some species also more accurately reflected current site conditions rather than variation in burn history like we saw for Carex or that Pennsylvania sedge. And that's due to the life history strategy of those plants. They're adapted to grow very quickly when conditions allow, so they might not be as sensitive to long-term or site-level differences. And some management implications that we've taken away so far. are that tracking plant growth in phenology could be useful to provide us with information about the resiliency of pine barrens communities. So if there's some baseline for change where we can see a certain number of burns corresponds to an important change in a mean trait value, that could be very informative for prescribed burn management. However, only certain species appear to respond to burn history. So it's really important to choose the correct species for these types of surveys. Like I said, the evergreens were not very informative. Blueberry showed the greatest overall variation, and the results for sweet fern also look promising. Sand cherry is another one very widespread that I think would potentially be good for this type of survey, but we did not investigate that species. And finally, the timing, frequency, and the responses that are included in phenology surveys need to be adapted so that they're appropriate for a specific system, or in this case, the droughty, nutrient-poor soils that are just going to constrain growth across the board. And so we just want to make sure that we are adjusting the count groups and also capturing important phenological events like leaf bud breaking and flowering. And that's where we're at with these results. They're ongoing. Sarah Johnson at Northland College actually has a student who is still chipping away at some of the leaf area analysis at Northland College. But I would like to thank a lot of people who were involved in the project. So of course, the Lake Saints Fire Science Program for funding this intern opportunity. Northland College provided additional salary to extend our intern experience. And then another student has also been assisting, Bridget Thornburg. The Schwamigan Nicolay was extremely helpful for burn coordination and crew logistics. The Washburn Ranger District provided really vital research coordination, especially Robert Lieberman and Brian Haringa. And the Northern Research Station helped us with obtaining permits and also providing feedback on our proposal. So with that, I'll take any questions that anyone might have. Let's see. I see one in the chat, and chime in here, Jack, if you're there. I see one question about the fire return interval. So it looks like someone said, we've only lost 3 intervals to suppression, but 99% of historic habitat extent. Is that true? So that figure is based on the entire extent of jack pine barrens throughout the Great Lakes region. And a lot of the habitat loss is due to factors other than fire suppression. So that includes land conversion to agriculture and any other source that might result in habitat loss.
Hi, Kathleen. This is Melinda. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It looks like Jack has left the conversation and you are now hosting. And by the way, great talk. We're fascinated with the blueberry work.
Okay, there's another question in the chat I can answer really quick. So Ali says, you mentioned some of the evergreen species might not be useful for plant functional trait studies. Did you look at abundance of these different species in the different treatments? Yes, we are doing that through the core study that I was a postdoc on, which is funded through the Joint Fire Science Program. So we're looking at the soil heating process and how soils and plant communities respond to fire. But that is another beast, and it wasn't necessarily measured during this study. We will have those data though. And yes, abundance definitely does vary across sites. I don't have data on that right now, but blueberry was the only species present at every site. And sweet fern, I think, was at all of the sites but one, whereas the evergreen plants were less common among sites. And then in terms of which or how the grass and sedge species were chosen, so Danthonia and Carex were surveyed based on the fact that those were the predominant grasses. We wanted to have one or the other. It might have ended up just being Danthonia. I'm still doing some QA/QC, and I think that plants were initially identified as Carex, but they were actually all poverty oatgrass. So it was just, we did initial surveys to see what was there and then tried choosing the most common species that were present across sites. Nope, no consideration of C3, C4. But yeah, that would be another trait that we could pull from other databases. We were pretty limited, even just having those 6 species. It was a lot of data collection. We did not control for aspect, but it is very flat here. So there's a rolling topography from the glacial outwash in this area, but it's pretty flat and none of our sites were on steep slopes. It'd be very, very minimal differences. Oh, and aspect, sorry. Yeah, because it's flat, they weren't necessarily facing different directions, but I do think a lot of the differences that we observed between unburned and burned sites in terms of their soil temperature and moisture result from those long unburned sites being largely surrounded by forest. So even though they're open canopy, they are going to be shaded for a longer portion of the day than a barren site that exists in a really large open barrens area versus a small fragmented open area. Okay, I hope I got to all of the questions. I'm guessing we should switch speakers. So I'm going to stop my screen share and switch over really quick and let Jack take over.
Okay, this is Melinda and Kate at Leafside Tribal College. I don't see Jack in the list of participants, so we're just going to try to go with it.
Okay.
So we're going to try something else here. There, how does that look, Kath? Are you able to hear us?
We can't hear anybody else. Chat. Can everybody hear us?
Great, thank you so much. All right, we will turn this over to Kate Haigston from the Division of Resource Management.
So I am Kate Hickston. I'm the Plant Program Director for the Division of Resource Management over at Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. And not able to change the slide, maybe. This was a collaboration with Melinda Neville, who I will be passing the baton to. Doug Castendick from the Northern Research Station was unable to make it due to other time conflicts. But in case you aren't familiar, the Leech Lake Reservation is located in central Minnesota. About 90% of the land area is shared with the Chippewa National Forest, and it creates this really unique opportunity for us to collaborate on projects like this. And in addition to all of the Chippewa National Forest, we also have DNR and 4 different counties that overlap within this area, as well as private ownership. So we have quite a bit of different things going on around the landscape. So the overall goals for this project, it was decided to do this area. It's one of 7 locations throughout the state that there was key identifiers that we were looking for, mainly a lack of timber harvest. And so our goal, it's very rare to have this type of ecosystem on the landscape. And one of the things that we've been noticing in this area is that in the areas where a canopy gap does exist, we are starting to see hardwoods persisting, and our goal is to increase the regeneration of those fire-tolerant pine species. And so we want to use fire as a way to maintain that ecosystem. And I'm not sure if everybody does it potentially. We're trying to figure out technology. Sorry, everybody. I hope we don't lose internet. Sorry about that. Technology. So along with this project and our objectives that we're trying to, specifically, we've been measuring, so we have, we're trying to improve the vegetation conditions as I stated. And so we're looking at the herbaceous layer and measuring. We have 15 monitor plots throughout the area, and we've been looking at each one of those to identify the herbaceous plants that persist there. This photo was taken with one of the researchers in the area. It's a 249-year-old red pine. So there's been decades of fire suppression throughout here, which, as I said, was shifting the species out of their natural range of variation. And the reintroduction of fire is to achieve that old growth characteristic that we're seeing less and less of on the landscape. The managed and unmanaged control areas, we have 4 different locations, and mostly pine dominant species, 15 plots per area. And Melinda kind of goes into this a little bit more, so I don't want to steal any of her information, but the main goal here is that we aren't seeing as many blueberries that are fruiting in these locations. As Kathleen was talking about it, it's pretty common that we see blueberry plants within our fire dependent communities, but to actually, what has kind of inspired us is that we aren't seeing the blueberries actually fruiting. So that's when we started working with the tribal college to deploy the HOBO sensors and look at different factors that might be influencing that. But so again, the forest and why it was chosen, so there's of 7 different spots throughout the state, throughout Itasca County, that we wanted to look and see that there was no prior logging in this location. They have the old growth characteristics, and you'll have to forgive me because this is kind of Doug's wheelhouse on this, so he can speak more to the reasoning and some of those key features that they were looking for in choosing these forest conditions. But that's kind of a general overview of how it was chosen and what we've seen historically. So there's a lot of data been gathered in these locations that makes it optimal for this type of research.
Okay, thank you, Kate. So my name is Melinda Neville. I am Earth System Science instructor at Leech Lake Tribal College, and our motto is to provide higher quality education grounded in Anishinaabe values. And we're a small college located near Cass Lake, Minnesota, which is about 40-minute drive away from the Cutfoot Sioux Experimental Forest. We really are lucky to be able to coordinate very much with our Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe Division of Resource Management professionals, as well as the U.S. Forest Service. And this project is a really great collaboration of combining resources, shared mentorship, student training opportunities with both Native and U.S. Forest Service employees. So this project is now going into its third year. In year one, pre-burn assessments were completed using interns from Leech Lake Tribal College, managed and hired by the Division of Resource Management. Meanwhile, a lot of the training to do pre-burn assessment was coming from Doug with the Chippewa National Forest and Northern Research Station. And everything from vehicle logistics to transportation and time cards, as a collaboration, this is working really well. And so we have continued it into year three. So the site surveys from 2018 were really focused on the blueberry plant and fruit production at 74 plots within the Chippewa Cutfoot Sioux Forest. The center of each plot was determined and permanently marked, because once you burn, of course, most of our flags will be gone. Students drew intersection lines and took meter quads to document small woody debris and herbs and forbs. And small trees within a 12-foot radius were counted, and canopy cover was documented and photographed. So during this process, our interns gained skills in plant identification, data management, field skills, and just dealing with the logistics of the field season. So within the preliminary findings of 2018, our interns found blueberries at 60% of the sites or so, but found exactly 5 plants all summer that were bearing fruit, despite the area being known by elders in oral history as providing good berry picking in the past. Well, one of our hypotheses was that there was an unseasonable drought that correlated strongly with the average flowering time, and that perhaps the plants just dropped their flowers. But because of that, it's not possible to tease out the effects of fire suppression and canopy cover from the water stress on the plants. Either way, it wasn't a good year for blueberries. Well, meanwhile, we had been beta testing these HOBO environmental monitoring systems at our college and looking for a permanent home for them that served as a data source for ongoing research that was of particular tribal importance. And so this was a match made very easily with the Blueberry Project. And so in late 2018, the 3 HOBO stations were deployed at the Sunken Lake Blueberry Project. So now looking at year 2, and this is where we are absolutely utilizing the Lake States Fire Science Consortium grant to help fund the rest of the pre-fuel or pre-fire assessments, and then hopefully post-fire. But as you can see, the fire plan was approved but not implemented, and so we have not yet burned. The interns were able to complete the dead and downed wood assessments, and though we've got some of that data we'll show today, but a lot of it is still being analyzed. Because I had interns and we had other projects going on, we were able to actually take on a soil characterization project as well, since we were waiting for a fire. And since then, many students have been collecting and analyzing the HOBO EMS data. This means they're getting field experience, technology, remote sensing systems, and data analysis and data management experience while they're also getting a chance to be out in our beautiful North Woods. So some of the initial results from our 2019 fuel sampling, and these graphs were provided by Doug. And so he'll be more familiar with it if you want to shoot him an email if I managed to misinterpret this. But our interns this last summer did over 9,000 feet of Barrens transects within the Cutfoot Sioux Experimental Forest. That means we were out there counting all, as the students put it, counting every twig. However, of course, there's definitely methodology that doesn't require us to count every twig. We took litter and duff depths, and they were variable by stand type, but lower in the control treatment. And that's an interesting fact. We were hoping that the control and the burn would be more equal, but either way, we'll be looking at the pre versus post burn compositions at the surface. 1 and 100-hour fuels were higher in the mixed pine stands versus complete pine stands. So we got our mixed and our pine, and the places we're going to burn versus where we're going to have as control. And we've got 10-hour fuels that are very similar, and that's our green bars here, by treatments and stand types. The 1,000-hour fuels are higher in the mixed pine stands, but are at least similar by treatment. And here we get to our HOBOs. So HOBO is the brand name by Onset Corporation for these little guys over here. So we've got our data logger, which is the box on the pole here. It's solar powered. We have humidity and air temperature sensor, solar incidence, and this mess of tangles are all our sensors that are going down into the soil, where we have them inserted after a pit and then inserted sideways at 20, 40, 60, and 80 centimeters depth. And so right now what you're looking at with the blue lines is from October 2018 through January 2020 of air temperature data collected. And right now I'm just showing you one of the HOBO sensor arrays. We have 3 of them out there. And part of that is so that we can have a control and 2 experimental. But as of now, since we don't have the experimental treatment yet, they're all pretty similar. So what we're looking at with these lines is the soil temperature at particular depths. So the darker the line, the deeper the soil probe. And so you'll notice that the black, or the 80 centimeter line, has a lot less variation and is a lot less subject to surface temperatures than our yellow, which is the shallow 20 centimeter probe. And what's interesting is that even at 20 centimeters, it never froze or got to freezing temperatures, despite temperatures going down to -30. Here we've got our polar vortex, where we hit -40 last January 31st. And that was the first time we saw sub-freezing temperatures in our 40 centimeter probe. But in general, the snow cover prevents the soil from heating or cooling too quickly. Very much an insulating layer. Let's take a closer look at just the temperature sensors. So again, here was our polar vortex, right? And we can see that despite a fairly deep duff layer, that the surface is still very much a stochastic temperature environment with high peaks that correlate with air temperature. And we see a lesser response the deeper we go. Now there's little differentiation between the 20 and 80 centimeter depth. But when we're looking at freezing dynamics and also infiltration, which we'll get to next, there is quite a bit of interplay between these different soil layers. So co-located with our temperature sensors, we've got soil moisture sensors as well. And this is measured as water content or volume per volume. So the typical standard measure for this is going to be cubic meter per cubic meter. Now, this is quite a bit messier, but we'll take a moment to interpret the data. These are excessively drained soils. It's very fast infiltration, and we can see both seasonal and event response rates differ. Now, again, here we've got our 60 centimeter probe going a little bit haywire during that polar vortex with the -40-degree temps. Now, what I don't know yet is what exactly happened to the non-frozen moisture at that 60 centimeter depth during a time when the layer above it was freezing. So I don't know if this is an outlier or whether this was an actual valid data. But of course, you can see the spring thaw right here. And then after that, we can see individual storms, and we're actually going to take a closer look at this one. At the end of June this past year, we got about 5.5 centimeters of rain in 100 minutes. So that was about an inch or 2 inches and a tenth or so. And so I've drawn this blue box to indicate when it was raining versus the soil moisture response. So almost immediately, the precipitation reached the 20 centimeter depth. And almost at the same time it reached the 20, we also start seeing the soil moisture level go up at the 40 and the 60. That means as soon as it starts raining, we've got water infiltration down to 60 centimeters. That's a pretty impressive rate. Again, these are excessively drained soils. Now, it's almost a 2-hour lag before we see a signal at the 80 centimeter. So I'm guessing that at this particular site, it might have a small clay lens or some other thing going on. Now, one other option might be that the plant uptake that's happening at the shallower depth might be muting those signals a bit and slowing that infiltration down to the 80 centimeter mark. Now, what's interesting, as soon as it hits the 80 centimeter mark, we're seeing a major increase in the amount of moisture present. And I'm guessing that this 0.46 cubic meter per cubic meter indicates our saturation point for that particular layer. But note that we never actually get that kind of plateau in the other layers. So we definitely have some interesting dynamics here in the soils. And as soon as it stops raining, or as soon as we stop getting that signal from the upper layers, the moisture at 80 centimeter also flattens out quite quickly. Since we didn't have a burn, we had our students start doing some soil analysis. And so one of our interns took 6 mineral soil samples from each of our HOBO sites and dried, sieved for texture. And then we also collaborated with Bemidji State University for their muffle furnace, which allowed us to estimate organic matter by loss on ignition. Now, most of our soils are going to end up on the soil texture triangle down in this area. It's very sandy, relatively low percentages of silt. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this, you triangulate 3 lines to add up to 100%. So if we have 10% silt and 40% clay, that means that we're going to have, here's the 40. We're going to have about 50% sand. And so you triangulate based on the sieving size of the soil texture. And so it's not surprising that we're really close to the higher sand side of the texture triangle, simply because we're all in glacial outwash until. So we've got our soil types here, but what's interesting is how low our organic matter is. With an excessively drained soil, I guess it's not that surprising, but in general, the estimated organic matter is less than 2% in these sandy soils. So why are we getting all of this data? What is the point where we're talking about fire, right? But we expect that the fire will result in a decrease in the litter and duff layers, exposing patches of mineral soil, which has implications for runoff and erosion. And these exposed soils will probably show even increased infiltration rates and temperature reactivity because of the changing texture from having an intense fire. The low initial organic matter with the mineral soil likely won't change significantly on the short term, but we know from other fire studies that potassium, calcium, and magnesium are likely to increase in availability. So our next steps, we're really looking at that nutrient availability, both pre and post burn. We'll of course test our loss on ignition and texture again. And those are great activities for students to learn about soils and the implication on soils from fire. The HOBO environmental monitoring systems will be dug up and serviced during the burn. We have not figured out how to fireproof them, so they will have to be removed before burning, and we'll replace them shortly thereafter. And we expect that this ongoing project will yield data for several years, and we're going to continue the partnership with the Forest Service, with Division of Resource Management, and train another generation of students. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kate, and she'll talk a little bit more about the importance of blueberries and what we'd expect to see in the future.
Thanks, Melinda. I really appreciate it. I want to point out again, it's just been so great to have this collaboration with all of the agencies. As I'm sure many of you know, in the community, there's a lot of red tape that surrounds the implementation of a burn. And since it's a fairly new practice in the Chippewa National Forest, we are still in the developing phases of trying to encourage people that this practice is something that's crucial to maintaining these type of ecosystems and crucial to the production of blueberries. So of course, blueberries are extremely important to the Ojibwe culture, and not only that, they offer a substantial amount of nutrients, and more than so the cultivated blueberries. And something that is crucial to blueberries thriving is to have pruning that goes on, as well as pollination. And I thought it was very interesting that Kathleen was pointing out, looking at the surface leaf index, and I would love to chat with her more about that as we continue on with this project in the coming years. I think it would be very beneficial for us to understand better how fire is a natural way to offer that pruning to the blueberry plants. And you can replicate that process through mowing, but of course that's not very efficient or economical. So other fire effects that would benefit the blueberries, so in addition to kind of maintaining that ecosystem in its state, it opens up the canopy, it provides the sunlight, it reduces insects and disease that would be building up throughout the winter. And as Melinda was talking about, the soil texture and just the pH levels of the soils to help maintain those in the communities and allow the plants to continue to thrive. So something that we talked about before in previous years, and something that we're still interested in looking for, is potential collaborators to look at the correlation of pollinators on blueberry plants. We have certain areas that we've planted blueberries in the communities, just in our gardens, that we can use as something to look at in comparison to how more wild blueberries are responding. Wild pollinators are much more vigorous than if you have a cultivated pollinator. So if you're having honeybees and you're purposefully using them as a pollinator, there's some work that we've been looking into as far as how much more vigorous the native pollinators are compared to more of a cultivated pollinator. And then of course, looking at cultivated blueberries versus wild blueberry plants. We want to thank, of course, everybody for their collaboration. We had a few extra students this year. All of our contact information is listed for further discussions and how we can move forward with this project, because we will be continuing this on. So we want to thank Lake States Fire Consortium for their support, and we can take any questions now. See if we can find the questions. Jack had technical issues again. Technology.
So we are happy to answer any questions. Looks like we still have plenty of participants online. Again, I'll point out that we've got our email addresses up here too if you want to ask later.
So with that, I think
we'll call it. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you have a great rest of the week. Again, Melinda and Kate here at Leech Lake Tribal College and Leech Lake Vanderbilt Ojibwe. Miigwech, Gigawabaman.